you for coming. Thank you. I think the starting point for conceptualizing this panel was really to look at how people think about their own security. And a lot of discourses on human security really sort of focus at the way states see security, and still that's the dominant paradigm, in security studies, is how states understand their security and are focusing on the security of states. And actually, even in ASEAN and in Southeast Asia, states haven't really focused on security from the point of view of ordinary people. It's still really from their point of view. So I wanted to put together a panel where we sort of contemplate how people think about their personal security and how they conceptualize security and manage their own security. And this could be a starting point for how we reconceptualize human security, I think globally as well as in Southeast Asia. So we've got 3 panels, and I think we sort of have an open format so we can sort of share our ideas and then spend some time in discussion. So we thought maybe we'll do all the 3 papers first and then open the space for discussion. Is that all right?
That's all right.
Yeah, I hope you have lots of questions. Brilliant. Good. So
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try not to make it too formal. It will seem background. So, yeah, I'm talking about the papers based on a research project that I started a couple of years ago on security and self-governance among the Chin as urban refugees. And it really developed from my PhD research and the book that I wrote from the Karen on the Thai-Burma border, which was looking at the role of refugees themselves in managing the camps and the role of refugees in administration of justice and a kind of governance from below, but also the pluralism of how that is shaped by and intersects with national and international security policies. And so, I don't know, well, you've done work with the communities and the Korean communities, and there's just such strength in the community organization among the ethnic nationalities. And what I was curious about from the camp situation was how would that translate to urban settings? So how much was it the camp that was kind of creating the space for organization, and how much was it a cultural capacity, if you like, for this kind of self-governance? So that's why I started doing this project with the Chin. There's 3 field sites. There's KL in Malaysia, New Delhi, and then Aizawl in Mizoram in the northeast of India. And the idea was that by tracing the Chin through these 3 sites of urban refuginess, that I would kind of get some more light into what this relationship is between security and self-governance, what makes refugees insecure, and how do they kind of govern themselves in response to those security threats. So my approach generally with research is to try and take like a very wide angle lens to try to gather as much information as I can so that I feel like the themes are emerging rather than being imposed. And that worked well, I think, when I was doing camp-based research, because I was able to sort of see the camp as a whole rather than isolating justice and security in a way that's quite artificial. It's been more challenging with a comparative project because, in effect, what I have are 3 very distinctly different case studies, and so they're not complying with my need for them to form a consistent case study, and they're actually proving to be quite different. So, yeah, as you know, in Malaysia, the security question is about securitization of forced migration. It's the fact that they're being labelled as illegal, they're being policed really aggressively. And in Delhi, the security and insecurity is much more rooted in, so in KL, I find I'm looking at criminology and mobility literature, I'm looking at securitization of forced migration, and that seems like the logical and natural way to interpret that situation. In Delhi, it's very much about economic insecurity. It's not that the Chin are refugees or even that they're from Burma, it's that they're economically marginal, they're living in marginal communities, they're exploited in the labour market. It's a kind of insecurity that comes through poverty and economic vulnerability rather than one that's rooted in their status as refugees. And then in Mizoram and Aizawl, the security question that I'm finding there is one that's about identity, and that's what I want to talk about today, and the idea of the construction of identity and its role in security and insecurity. So in a sense, it's really obvious. Identity is intrinsic to security, right? You look at race or gender or class or any of the criminology about vulnerability and security, and it's clear that who you are perceived to be or how you define yourself shapes your security. And I don't think we talk about that very explicitly often in terms of refugees. I mean, we talk about refugee status, but there's also questions about being a foreigner, being an illegal, being an other, and they're quite different things. And so in Mizoram, it's not the fact that people are refugees that's shaping their identity, it's the fact that they're perceived as other. Anyway, that's what I'm arguing. So when I've been writing or trying to write about this, I'm looking at it in terms of borders and boundaries, and the idea that you have, you know, the cartographic border on the map, that's your division between citizen and foreigner. You also have the cognitive boundaries of identity, and those are defining who's inside, who's outside, and the cartographic border and the cognitive boundary often are not aligned. They might be, they might not be. And so what I found in Mizoram was that the border was staying static, but the meaning of the border seemed to be changing, and the boundaries between Chin and Mizo were kind of being dismantled in the process. And so, again, when I'm trying to write about this, I'm looking at this shift from the Chin as other to the Chin as brother, and that brother language is something that's being used very explicitly. So I don't want to overstate the case. I mean, I have to be quite careful about how far I take these claims, but I do think there's, if it's not a good news story, it's like a slightly better than usual news story for refugee situations, because we're so accustomed to the trajectory being, you know, things get worse, relationships between incoming populations and the host community getting worse, and I think in some ways this is a case study where it seems to be getting better. And what I'm going to try and show is that it's not getting better accidentally. There's some deliberate processes at work that are actually changing the way that people are viewed and defined. So I'll just try and give a quick backdrop to Mizoram and the Chin. Some people maybe aren't familiar with it. Mizoram is in the Northeast Territories of India. It's the eastern border of India, and it's bordering Chin State on the western borders of Myanmar. And it's one of those areas in the northeast where you have a border that's going through a population who share a great deal in common. And so both Mizos and Chin recognize a common heritage. So Mizos recognize that they migrated from Chin State to Mizoram. Physically, they look similar, their languages are very closely related, culturally they're similar. They passed through the same colonization, conversion to Christianity, political insurgency. They've gone through quite similar milestones in political development. And there was an insurgency in Mizoram between 1965 and 1986, and that's kind of about the time when things started getting much worse for the Chin in Myanmar. So the border is quite porous. At the time of the Mizo insurgency, people were going to Myanmar. More recently, it's all been in the other direction. So the estimates are that there are about 100,000 Chin in Mizoram, and they don't have refugee status, which I can go into later if people want to know more about that. But 100,000 Chin is about 10% of the Mizo population, so it's a really substantial number of people. And given all the kind of points of common heritage and so on, you might think that there would be a relative acceptance or a tolerance of the Chin, and that's not historically been the case. There was quite a lot of resentment and quite a lot of discrimination, and at various points pushbacks and people being pushed back over the border to Myanmar. But during my fieldwork, which was last summer, then I kept being told things are better than they used to be. The relationship's much better. And I was skeptical, obviously, that was just something that I was being told because Mizos had an interest in making the situation seem better and because Chin were afraid of repercussions. But over time and over the course of the interviews, I started becoming much more convinced that there really had been a change, that there had actually been this attitude shift. And then I was trying to look at, how and why has this happened? And so, thinking first, I'll say a few things briefly about the ways that the Chin were constructed as others. So despite this shared common heritage and so on. It's a border area, and so Myanmar's borders basically means lots of black market border trade, and there's been a lot of that coming into Mizoram over the years. And a lot of drugs coming into Mizoram from the east. So there's been a lot of drug addiction problems, first with heroin, then amphetamines, and now an emerging methamphetamine problem. And locally, among the Mizo's, that's seen very much as the responsibility of the Chin, right? They are the people bringing these drugs to our society, they are bringing these social evils. And there's also an accusation alcohol was prohibited in Mizoram until 2015. For about 20 years it was a dry state. But people are resourceful and wanted to drink, so there was still quite a fairly readily available supply of alcohol, which again was blamed on the Chin. These were the people who were creating an alcohol problem, who were creating alcoholism, and so they were seen as bringing these social evils. Not just drugs and alcohol, but theft, burglary, rape, murder, pretty much all crime was seen as the Burmese responsibility or the Chin responsibility. And a quote or a saying that several people said to me, some joking, some quite serious, the Mizo saying was, "Nothing good comes from the east but the sun." So, this idea that everything that was damaging and destructive from the society was coming from Burma, and it was the fault of the Chin. And so there was a fairly strong narrative of kind of deviance and wrongdoing and crime being situated with the Chin. And of course there was some involvement of people from Burma in the drugs trade, and of course there was some involvement. It's a question of perception and the degree of it. So the popular perception would be that 90% of crime is committed by Burmese. The statistics, as far as I can get them, which is quite difficult, but like excise and narcotics statistics would show fewer than 20% of customs and excise arrests were coming from foreigners. So the vast majority of crime is in fact being committed by locals, but the perception is the reverse, and that there was this clear sense that the Chin from Burma were kind of being othered through these narratives of deviance and wrongdoing. And that basis of crime and wrongdoing was the pretext for the pushbacks. So there was on a couple of occasions anti-foreigner campaigns which were very clearly targeting people from Burma and pushing them back to Myanmar, and this was on the basis that they were bringing crime to the society. And so that was kind of the background that I'd come to Mizoram with, knowing this context of scapegoating, knowing the context of mass pushbacks, and expecting to hear much more about that. And then not really what I was hearing, which was it's changing, that hasn't happened for several years, the situation now is quite different. And so I had that gap really between what I was expecting to find and the data I was getting, and not quite sure which to believe. And then there was quite an interesting incident last summer that seemed to sort of say something significant. And you might remember that the monsoon last year in Myanmar was particularly heavy, and there were landslides and there were several disasters, and Chin State was one of the worst affected areas. So there were landslides in the capital of Hakka, there were hundreds of houses that were destroyed, thousands of people were homeless, the roads were blocked so they couldn't get any food in, and it was kind of quite a serious disaster. And the response in Mizoram was really immediate and really, really interesting, because they just started this enormous fundraising drive where they had the churches were holding vigils and they raised an enormous amount of money. Mizo singers and musicians started organising benefit concerts. They were in the streets, and then they did a TV call-in benefit, and there were all sorts of different things happening. The student unions donated lunch money from all students in the state. And at that time I was travelling around Mizoram, so I was kind of seeing not just Aizawl, but quite across the state. And every place that I went to, the same dynamic of fundraising for the Chin was underway. And all of it was happening under this narrative of helping our brothers and sisters in Burma. It was very much under a rubric of kinship. And so it might not seem, it might seem that of course something bad has happened in Chin State, why wouldn't they help? But it was clear that this was something unprecedented, that it was marking really, it was seen by both Chin and Mizos as marking quite an important milestone in their relations. So when I interviewed Chin people, they were really amazed that this was happening, they couldn't believe it. Some of the main association that had organised the anti-foreigner campaigns was organising lorry loads of rice. The people who had been ringleaders in pushing people back were now ringleaders of this charity. And it was really a huge kind of cognitive shift for both Chin and Mizo, and it was something that seemed, to mark an important milestone. And it might also be worth noting that in 2008, there was famine in Chin State, so it's not that this was the first time there'd been serious humanitarian needs. And at that time, some of the Mizo singers performed in benefits organised by the Chin, but they charged for their time, right? They weren't doing this as a fundraising thing, they were doing it as a professional booking. So just to contrast from one situation of need to the other. So why did I think this was happening? Why was there this shift to a narrative of brotherhood? So there's a few different possible explanations. And I think we were saying earlier, the risk of trying to kind of impose a narrative onto a situation sometimes, are you trying to kind of find a story that's not really there? And I think with this, of course, the first point is to recognize the changing environment in Myanmar, right? So although the changing environment in Myanmar hasn't made the situation in Chin State significantly better yet, it has reduced so people aren't returning in large numbers, but they're not leaving in large numbers either. So it seems quite probable that the Mizos are less anxious about the influx than they may have been a few years ago. Another dynamic was a greater understanding of the Chin and a greater understanding, if you like, of the other. And this is something that had been quite deliberate. So one of the outcomes of the exodus of Chin as refugees has been the creation of a diaspora. So quite a lot of Chin have been resettled to the US, and they've become educated, they're professional, they're a relatively powerful transnational diaspora. And that's very, very different from the notion that Mizos have of the Chin as these destitute, needy people who are coming and selling bamboo shoots. And those Chin leaders in the US had quite explicitly tried to target Mizo public opinion to try to improve the view of the Chin. And so they'd invited singers and musicians who were famous and well respected, and then they invited them to the US to perform for the resettled Chin, and they treated them very well. And then when the singers went back and they were interviewed by TV and radio, they would say, this was a wonderful experience, and that was exactly what the Chin leaders had wanted, right? They were really trying to engage with and change public opinion to show that Chin are not deviant criminals, actually they are also existing in this other thing. So that was quite a deliberate attempt to change public opinion. It was also clear that more Mizo people were traveling to Myanmar. Now it was possible to do that. And so they were making TV programs and documentaries and showing, Yangon and Mandalay and cities that are developed, and showing things that people, again, weren't necessarily associating with the kind of destitution of the Chin. They were actually showing that Myanmar was pretty wealthy and quite powerful, and kind of trying to change opinion in that way. And then the third aspect, which I sort of think is the most important and the one that I'm developing most in writing about this, was about trying to change the way that people were thinking about Mizo and Chin identity. So the people in Mizoram who are most sympathetic to the Chin are those who see this kind of brotherhood, this kinship, this sense that Mizo and Chin are brothers and sisters, that they are related. And in the northeastern India, generally there's quite a few cosmopolitan identity movements, like pan-ethnic identity movements that are trying to kind of unite different groups under a wider umbrella. And for the Chin and the Mizo, the most powerful of those has been Zo identity. And that Zo identity incorporates people who are currently in Mizo, the people who are currently in Chin State, and also people currently known as Kukis. So it includes several states in northeast India, it includes parts of Myanmar, and it includes Chittagong hill tracts in Bangladesh. So the Zo identity is quite a kind of potent cross-border pan-ethnic movement. And that began in the 1990s in Mizoram with the Zo Reunification Organization. And as far as I could find out, when Zoro began, they had kind of relatively little mainstream support. They were quite marginal. It was quite a kind of not really taken particularly seriously as an identity movement. But over the next couple of decades, there's been a lot more mobilization around Zo identity. So it's not just Zoro, there's Zofa Global Network, there's Zo Indigenous Forum, there's a lot more mobilization around this pan-ethnic identity. And it's operating at multiple levels. So they engage with the UN indigenous rights mechanisms, they hold events and festivals and gatherings, and they're kind of trying to really recognize and celebrate this kinship. And so in one way, the idea that Chin and Mizo are brothers and sisters isn't something that's come out of nowhere, right? People would have historically recognized this relationship in Mizoram, but what this identity message is doing is turning that kind of intellectual recognition into something that's more of a sense of solidarity, right? It's not just that, okay, we come from that place and we're related. It's more like we are co-ethnics, and it's changing the way that that identity is viewed. And that seemed to be very clear in those fundraising efforts around the landslide. The message was very much about we are all brothers and sisters in Zo, we're all a family of Zo. This kind of, the Zo identity was very potent in the way that people were fundraising. And it seemed like over those kind of past 20 years, that message that was maybe quite unpalatable to begin with was becoming much more accepted, not just by a few activists, but also by the really mainstream opinion formers like the church and like the organizations that had previously been quite opposed to the Chin presence. So yeah, this is kind of a provisional paper, and I'm conscious that I don't want to, as I said, overstate the case too much. I think there's still a strong sense of difference between Mizo and Chin, and there's certainly still a sense among many Mizos that Chin are responsible for criminality and that they have brought these social evils. So it's not transformed the views overnight, but I do think there's been an attitudinal shift towards the Chin as other, and that prejudice and discrimination that had been happening much more 10 or 20 years ago has really been decreasing. And so in terms of where that puts this as a kind of security study or an identity study, I suppose the concluding points were recognizing that identity is part of security, right? How you're viewed, whether you're seen as the other, the extent to which you're seen as somebody who is one of us is a really important question that we're not always addressing head on in terms of how we think about security. And when we do think about that relationship, there's a tendency to assume, probably as I had been doing, that identities will inevitably harden against those who are coming from the outside, that's kind of how the trajectory is likely to operate. Where I feel like Mizoram is actually suggesting a potential for a different trajectory, which is one of kind of actively engaging with that hardening against the other and trying to shift it and change it and manipulate it in a way that's not coincidence, that's actually a deliberate attempt to try and change the way that we're thinking about the other. And so in terms of identity, there's a huge, of course we recognize that identity is deliberately constructed, that we construct these boundaries between insider and outsider, and the point from this was that we can also dismantle those boundaries, and that maybe as we're looking at other situations around the world where it feels at the moment that we're in Europe particularly in this kind of really isolationist, hardening frame of mind, then maybe this is a case study that shows that that's not necessarily the outcome. So that's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we thought we'd do all of the presentations together first, and then we'll have the discussion later. Yeah. So Anya will now present.
Can I sit in your place, maybe? Because
You're gonna talk with them. Yeah, you're using the pictures.
Not many, but a few. Okay. I'm Anya. I work in the University of Gothenburg. I have done over the past 3-4 years a project on Burmese labor migrants in Penang in Malaysia and Georgetown, particularly the city. And I have so I work basically with the Burmese majority, the Burman kind of working class peasant type labor migrants, as a difference to many others on these ethnic minorities, but I think there are a lot of things that the shared kind of understanding is. I wanted to start, I worked a lot with Security Station, and I wanted to start just with an image of what happened around the major crackdown in Malaysia in 2013 on illegal migration. In August of 2013, the government launched its biggest ever crackdown on illegal migration, and the goal of this operation, they stated it publicly, was to hunt down and flush out about 500,000 illegal migrants from the country. And this was, no doubt, a very impressive operation in terms of size. It involved an allegedly, or according to media sources, 135,000 personnel from the Immigration Department, the Royal Malaysian Police, the Malaysian Voluntary Corps Rela, the Armed Forces, the Civil Defense, the National Registration Department, and the local council. And of course, those of you familiar with Malaysia know that this was not the first time that Malaysia had taken action to combat illegal migration, but Immigration Department Director General, he assured the public that this time it was really time for full enforcement. And the operation would, he told the newspaper The Star, it would be a cat and mouse game for which the authorities were fully prepared. He said, "We are aware that they know we are coming for them, and come Sunday they will suddenly disappear. They can hide, but how long can they hide? This is not a one-off crackdown, but a 3-month non-stop operation throughout the country." I was in Gothenburg at the time, and I was trying to reach my Burmese friends and the respondents in Penang to see what was going on. And after a couple of days, I managed to get in touch with my interpreter and a few friends. And they had then left the apartment where they live, where I usually stay during the field visits, and they were sleeping in a friend's house. And they were speaking about fear in a kind of new way. They were basically saying that migrants in Malaysia, in all communities, were frightened and petrified or terrified of this situation. Some of them had resigned from their jobs, they were staying indoors, they didn't want to go out, and others were trying to look for ways to return to Myanmar, even though that was not so easy, because as one guy said, he said, "There's a jam in the smuggler's office." Like, okay. Now, the only source of information that they had was, of course, the Malaysian media. So they asked me for more information. And I mean, the Malaysian media was basically just blasting out the magnitude of this operation. And they asked me, is this serious? How long will it go on? And one of my friends, she said, "If I stay inside the flat for a few weeks, then do you think it will be safe if I don't go out at all?" And I think this crackdown showed a sort of peak in Malaysian Security Station and the securitized language around immigrants, and this whole idea of speaking of immigrants as something that needs to be flushed out of the country, etc., etc. But it needs to be understood in the context of these increasingly securitized policies that Malaysia has employed. What's interesting about the Malaysian case, I think, and I'm looking at securitization of migration also in the European case, and the Greek case particularly, is that the focus has been almost exclusively upon internal border controls rather than external border controls. So that securitization has involved the Royal Malaysian Police has been granted extensive powers to arrest and detain people suspected of violating the Immigration Act. The Voluntary Corps Rela, who are like notorious in Malaysia, have been armed and assigned the task of assisting the Immigration Department in dealing with migration, whatever that means. And illegal migrants have been criminalized and are liable to quite heavy punishments. Amongst the more perhaps noteworthy is the caning, and that was introduced in 2002, right? Yeah. Now, what these policies do, and I think this is really relevant for the Malaysian case, is that, and I think as Graces Mascarenhas, I can never pronounce her name, has shown, is that Malaysian policies have tried to limit migration through limiting rights rather than numbers. And I think that's quite particular for the Malaysian case. So despite the kind of official rhetoric around we need to combat irregular migration, this framework has not aimed to do that. It has rather aimed to do something else. And I think if we borrow some of the understanding from broader migration studies, and particularly the work of de Genoa, for example, what this production of illegality has done, the legal production of illegality has done, and what it serves, the purpose it serves is to discipline the migrant workforce in different ways. And it has been successful in doing that and in creating what some human rights organizations have called a climate of fear in like the migrant communities. In my own work then, in the Burmese migrant community in Georgetown, I think one of the absolute most strongest impressions from that is that fear, anxiety, or at least extreme caution is one of the most central aspects of migrants' everyday life in the city. It influences decisions around where to live, where to eat, where to work, how to get there, during which hours, and so on. And I think experiences of fear and strategies around how to avoid danger are some of the most common topics of informal conversations that you have when you spend time in the migrant communities, like the text messages of warning of an upcoming raid or that whole kind of thing. Speculation around what has happened to people who have been apprehended, how can you get their number in order to access a detention center. I mean, all of these things are very much at the center of attention. In my interviews then, I had the question of, do you feel safe in Malaysia, which was like obviously answered with a fairly unanimous no, and many of the respondents, they even responded or reacted to this question by laughing, like, what do you mean? It's like, is that a question that you can actually ask? Now what I've been interested in doing in my work is to explore the performance of fear in everyday life for migrants. What does fear do in life? So I'm not interested in the psychological or perhaps even sociological aspects of this, but rather fear as a sort of socio-spatial practice. What does it do? What's the performativity of fear in everyday life? And I recently published a paper called Another Geography of Fear in Urban Studies, where I kind of go through this. And what I argue in this paper, and what I will argue today, is that why fear in urban space has preoccupied geographers, criminologists, and sociologists for a very long time. And such scholarship has brought forward like a lot of important insights around the relationship between fear, mobility, and social exclusion. Legal exclusion has largely been left outside the kind of scope of inquiry. But legal status is, of course, as we know, probably all of us in this room, an important axis, or an increasingly important axis of marginalization. And I think it's important to note that this does not only include de facto exclusion of rights based on gender or class or ethnicity, race, and so on, but de jure exclusions based on non-citizenship status. So the legal exclusion in urban space does not just include illegal migrants who are de facto not have the right to stay in the urban space or the territory at all, but also low-skilled labor migrants often who face restrictions in their social and civil rights. And this fundamental distinction between citizens and others as insiders and outsiders then is very important for how urban space is perceived and navigated, which is surprisingly understudied in particularly geographical literature. It produces, I have argued, another geography of fear in which spatial strategies are not primarily developed in response to the fear of crime, or with which previous scholarship has been very preoccupied, but rather in response to the fear of state institutional practices. So police controls, roadblocks, and raids. So in order to investigate this further then, I have worked with mental mapping. And I want to show you a couple of these maps. A fairly badly pasted picture of one of these maps. So this exercise that I did was basically to ask the respondents in my interviews to draw Georgetown, their city, and to mark with a green color pencil sites that they perceived as safe, orange, semi-safe, and red, dangerous. And while we don't have time, like it's beyond the scope of this, to do a deeper analysis of these maps, I think they do invite us to think further about migrants' fears, migrant security, and migrants' consequent geography or navigation of urban space. First of all, what these maps and my study convey very clearly is that urban space is understood and navigated as a borderscape. The border is not, of course, found here in like a fixed site and so on, but its location corresponds directly with the bodily movement of enforcement officers. So where enforcement officers decide to set up a roadblock, that's where the border is. Second, the migrants' freedom of movement is effectively limited through these threats of the continuous police controls, which you don't really know where they are. But the threat of police controls is a threat not only to irregular migrants, but also to regular migrants. I mean, in the case of irregular or illegal migrants, it's very clear, it has a clear connection to their criminalized status and that they face caning and imprisonment and all of those things. But for irregular migrants, many of those stated that they dread these encounters because they're associated with economic losses, right? Because if you are a migrant worker in Malaysia or in many other places, you're usually not in possession of your passport, right? But you carry a photocopy of the passport, which is then not recognized as valid identification, and you then face the option of either calling your boss, who has to come with a passport, or you pay some dude copy, a bribe, to be released. I just told Alice over breakfast that I interviewed this guy. I was very clear that bribery is like so important in order to negotiate illegality and the conditions of non-citizenship. But those who have been a long time in Malaysia, they develop these really cocky attitude in relation to bribery, which I thought was, I'm going to write a whole paper on that. And one guy, he had met, the police had come, and in Bahasa it's duit copy, right, which is coffee money, is what it's called, a bribe. And the police had stopped him and he'd said to him, so I need some duit copy. And the guy had given him 1 ringgit. And the police is looking at it going, what do you mean 1 ringgit? And the migrant that I interviewed, then he was like, you don't have to go to Starbucks, you can just go down the street and get a coffee. And it shows how this is just a whole game. It's just a regular thing that happens every day, and you have to negotiate your conditions, the condition of illegality and non-citizenship through continuous bribing of the police. Now, the most common spatial tactic that was conveyed in the interviews and maps was to limit the amount of time you spend in public space. And many of the migrants, this is a very typical map that I got, is it conveys a very nodal understanding of the city. So you maneuver between 3 distinct nodes. One is your home, the second is your workplace, and the third is Komtar, which is where you go to remit your money. That's where all the hundis, the informal money senders, are. So these are the spaces that you maneuver in between. Now, many of the people who drew these maps, they have been in the city for many, many years, and they're aware that it's out there, but it's not in their mental map. It doesn't involve their space. Another type of map, which was less common, but still very interesting, was this kind of map. And the respondent who drew this, he'd been in Malaysia for many years, and he specified his own understanding of the colors, right? He used his own way to do that. Now, what his map shows very clearly is that the border performs, and safety and danger in the city performs differently before different groups of migrants. Not just depending on your othered status or your illegality or your non-citizenship status, but a lot of different things. So what he said was, he started by, and this was a common objection when I gave the green color, and it's like, what do you mean safe? There's like no real safe place, but I'll draw green anyway. But what he did is he said, okay, safe mean green is almost safe, but be careful, right? Orange then marks places that he perceived as dangerous to 60%, which I thought was really a good way to capture that. Red was 100% dangerous, but then he added the shaded red, which was dangerous to 100% only if you don't have a driving license. license. If you drive a motorbike without a driving license. I don't know if you're familiar with Penang, but the area that he has kind of marked for this is the area where you actually leave to the mainland across the Penang Bridge, which I thought was quite interesting. He also added the blue dots, which was like always dangerous for illegal people due to operasi, that there can be like a crackdown or a raid. Now, safety and danger here also very clearly intersects bodily appearance and the way that your body is marked by foreignness, to use Greenberg's terminology. And amongst my respondents, it was really clear that there was like a general agreement that looking Burmese was not a good idea. Looking Burmese was dangerous. It was more dangerous. And they mentioned several bodily strategies that they used in order to stay out of sight. Keeping your head down, walking at a light, not making eye contact with the police or other Malaysians, which they could fear could report them. But there were not so many examples of people trying to dress in a Malaysian style, which we've seen in, for example, Lang's study from Thailand, which we talked about the other day, and stuff. They rather didn't. In fact, several of them responded. One guy I asked, so why don't you dress in Malaysian style? You pass as a Malaysian. And he was like, because I really don't like it. It's like a really ugly way of dressing. And that was like, that took over. On the other hand, I mean, none of them wore lungies or had tanaka on their faces when they went out. They all took that off before going out. So there was a certain degree of adaptation, but not this dressing in Thai style or Malaysian style. On the maps, I think it's important also to note that the gender encoding places as safe or dangerous. I mean, we have, of course, this is in many cases a community where people are fairly isolated from the rest of society, and domestic violence is, of course, a big issue also in this community. And there were several examples of this in the flat where I stayed, for example. And for migrant women then, I mean, even if the home was generally perceived as the safest place to be, that is, of course, a relative scale, right? Because of the way that you are excluded, not just on the basis of your legal status, but also your social status and your relative isolation from the rest of society. Now, if we think about this in terms of the human security framework, I think the human security framework can offer us a way to think in a new way about security, and perhaps also about securitization from like a human perspective, whatever. But I think that this framework also, this emphasis upon the weak state capacity as a kind of explanation for why people are not granted freedom from fear, freedom from want, and these things, I find that problematic. I would in fact argue that in the Malaysian case, the hardships facing the kind of the general migrant population and migrant workers, they result from deliberate and often perceived highly legitimate policies to control and manage foreign workers in Malaysia. And while securitization is one of the important explanations for this, for the high level of fear and the legal production of illegality, which like produces fear in amongst both regular and irregular migrant workers, which is often the same thing during different time periods. I think insecurity in general is produced also through all of these policies that have been implemented in Malaysia during the years, which effectively limit migrants' bargaining power vis-a-vis employers, their recruiters, and the state. And what these policies effectively do is that they amplify asymmetries of power and knowledge in the labor market, which we know are like the main cause of coercion and involuntariness amongst different groups. And the Malaysian policy, I think Alice's work on this is the best that we've seen, is the way that these policies award employers mechanisms of control over migrant workers that they don't have over citizens. And these hierarchies of rights, not just between citizens and non-citizens, but also between different groups of citizens, is a very important explanation for this lack of, or the decreasing bargaining power that migrants have, which leads to insecurities, to fears, and to other things. I think the Malaysian case, finally, then I'll finish, but I think the Malaysian case also shows something else, and I think it's important for strategies on how to increase human security, but also for, I was looking at the Myanmar immigration policy, for example, where there's a very strong belief in that legality somehow implies security, and that legality implies freedom. But I think the Malaysian case clearly shows that legality does not necessarily translate into a higher degree of freedom or security. On the contrary, many migrants in Malaysia, including the Burmese, they use the illegal status as an effective way to navigate to navigate coercion and involuntariness that they face in the labor market and in society. They abscond from their designated employers in order to increase their security from abuse and so on. So I'd be very cautious, I think, and I think we need to discuss this because there have been also in NGO communities, which we will talk about now, some sort of idea that we can protect refugees through giving them a regular migrant worker status, etc., etc. And I think the assumption that getting regularized is a solution to insecurity is in this context absolutely dangerous.
Thank you. Right, so my paper focuses on a different population. It focuses on human rights defenders at risk. And in this paper, I will focus more on those from Indonesia, although it's part of a bigger study that I'll explain to you about. Right, so what I'll cover today in this presentation is really, who are human rights defenders, what is protection, and who is involved in protection and how can we think about human rights defenders and their personal security. I'll share with you a bit about a current research project I'm working on that tries to understand how defenders navigate risks, manage security, and receive protection support, and share with you some preliminary findings. So who are human rights defenders? The legal definition really is derived from the 1998 Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which states that everyone has the right, individually and in association with others, to promote and strive for the protection and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms at the national and international levels. So it's really the focus that everyone has a right to defend their own rights and the rights of others. The common understanding of human rights defenders is really that they're activists or they work for NGOs, but actually the real meaning of it in the declaration is far wider than that. Human rights defenders can come from all sectors of society and backgrounds. They could be government or state actors, the police or parliamentarians, judges, government officials or ministers. They could also be journalists, trade unionists, doctors, teachers, social workers, farmers, mothers, writers, students, or you, if you promote or protect human rights, you can also be a human rights defender. A lot of us do it without being threatened, but actually some are threatened and attacked for their work, and thus need to be protected. So what does protection mean? Yeah? Protection is quite central in international relations and in the human rights regime. And in the international human rights regime, really we focus on states as the main duty bearer. Yeah? And states have a duty to protect the rights and security of people, as well as people against human rights abuses by third parties, such as businesses or criminal gangs, vigilante groups, paramilitary groups, and so on. So together with some colleagues from Amnesty International and London Metropolitan University, we put together this paper and two special issues actually that look at what we call the protection regime for human rights defenders, arguing that it isn't just an assemblage of practices that are random, but actually there's something that we can call an international regime. And Kasner provides the definition for an international regime, the principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actor expectations converge in a given issue area. And we find that actually conceptualizing this as a protection regime is useful in a number of ways, and we suggest that there are 5 features of this particular regime. And if you think of other kinds of protection regimes. There could be, for example, the international refugee rights regime, which has a different set of actors. Yeah? So what are the 5 features of this regime? First, it's rooted in the international human rights regime. It's derived from it, so really all the same principles apply. It is goal-driven, so it's to protect and support defenders who operate in their own context in the face of threats and risks. It adopts a human security paradigm, so it's really focusing on the security of individuals rather than the security of states. It's a multi-level regime. You have protection mechanisms and initiatives at the local, national, regional, and international levels. It has many stakeholders, not just states, but civil society groups, donors, human rights, national human rights institutions, sympathetic states, yeah, intergovernmental organizations, and so on. And all of them engage in protection practices as well. So when we think about this international protection regime, when we conceptualize it as a protection regime, it raises some questions. Yeah? How does this regime function and evolve? What is its structure? What are the power relations in this regime? And what are the effects of this regime, positive and negative, intended and unintended? In a sort of ideal situation, protection is really supposed to complement what defenders do for themselves. Yeah, if protection practices or interventions actually derail what defenders do for themselves, then it has a negative consequence. Right, so it really should be complementary. But and Chandler actually suggests that there's a difference between protection practices that are agent-centric and preventative, and an interventionist reactive approach to protection, which focuses more on the protection actors, focuses on the saviors. Even though that's commonly understood as best practice or good practice, there really is quite little research that focuses on how defenders navigate risks, manage their security, and receive support. And dominant accounts that you get in the media or in the public usually focus on an advocacy purpose, emphasizing threats and attacks, and in a very kind of more two-dimensional way, that they're threats and attacks, or try to position or explain the work of defenders in a way of building their profile and legitimacy. So you don't really get the sense of, how do these people actually think about their own security. So we started this research project last year, doing interviews and surveys with defenders in 5 countries: Colombia, Mexico, Egypt, Kenya, and Indonesia. And today I'll just focus on Indonesia, as we are in the Southeast Asian Symposium. In total, we have 400 respondents, but for the Indonesia section, we have about 80. And the researchers for these countries were part of the local human rights community. And actually, that's been really essential in getting defenders to share about the threats that they face. And what we focus on is really the everyday understandings of security. Yeah? So in Indonesia, the defenders that we interviewed are engaged in a broad range of human rights work: anti-corruption, freedom of religion, land rights, women's rights, LGBTI rights, the rights of people in conflict situations. And the 2 researchers who worked on this project with me went to Manokwari, Jayapura, Ambon, Aceh, Palu, and Jakarta. And the criteria for this study was that they interviewed people who have experienced risk in the last 5 years. And these risks vary from death threats to attempted assassinations, physical attacks against them and their family, surveillance, judicial investigation, stigmatization, criminalization. We deliberately tried to have equal numbers of men and women and a small number of transgender people as well. So the main perpetrators, it really depends on the kind of human rights work that we're doing. For those who focus on anti-corruption or violence in conflict situations, it's the intelligence, it's the police and military. For non-state actors, for the religious minorities, it's vigilante groups. For the LGBTI community as well, vigilante groups and Sharia police. And for housing and land rights, thugs from the same community, sometimes supported or often supported by public officials, the police, and so on. So it really depends on the work that they do. So some of the strategies for managing security, actually some of this resonates with what Anya was presenting, of restricting their own activities, avoiding routines, changing travel routes, being careful about what they say, choosing to avoid certain meetings or participate in some activities, being much more aware of their surroundings, and being aware of the surveillance that's conducted upon them. They try to plan ahead before key activities. They sometimes have a strategy of choosing who will be more visible in advocacy while keeping some others deliberately less visible. Networking is a key strategy, maintaining contact with networks for urgent actions and advocacy, as well as strengthening the capacity of victim groups so that the victim groups are not always calling on the defenders for assistance, but they can face their own risks themselves. We asked them what factors make you secure, and they say, having the support of family, neighbors, community members, and fellow defenders, both literally in protecting them physically, but also being a source of information, a kind of early warning system. And importantly, being a source of social and psychological support when they're threatened or attacked. People coming over and being with them, and the psychological support is really significant. Having a national and international profile for those who choose visibility as a security tactic was also important. What factors make them feel insecure? Unsurprisingly, death threats, but importantly also threats against their own family members. The media, for some of them, whenever there are negative stories about them, for example, the LGBTI community, then the public, they say, become more extreme. It increases the level of violence. And I think that's what Kristen mentioned as well. Potential perpetrators, criminal gangs, security forces, the police, and impunity and inaction by state authorities to the threats when they report them. So what are some of the preliminary findings we have found? Experiences of risk really depend on the type of work that people do, the geographical location, as well as the level of support they get from the community. And actually the concept of community is something that really needs sort of unpacking and breaking down. Defenders develop an instinctive security vigilance. They may not they develop this sort of way of thinking about the landscape, both consciously and subconsciously, sort of monitoring. And it's based on personal and collective experiences and histories of activism. So people often talk about Munir, for example, when they talk about human rights defenders and what happened to him. It looms large in their imaginary. Defenders rely on a number of tactics for personal safety and security, and they don't often call this something formal like security management or risk management, but they have instinctive ways of thinking about security. When asked about security, worries about the safety of family members is a strong theme because perpetrators also target family members. But some defenders face threats from their own family and community members as well, especially those who challenge social, cultural, and religious norms. Women human rights defenders, LGBTI defenders, defenders acting on community issues, where the victim and the perpetrator is from the same community. Some organizations take security quite seriously and develop protocols and procedures, but some don't, and it makes a huge difference when they do. We also asked them a question about mental and emotional health, if you think of psychological well-being as being part of security. And actually, a lot of defenders recognize that they don't pay enough attention to it, even though they know that they're stressed and tired and sick. And when we ask them why, they say, well, we don't really have time, or we don't really think about it. It's not something we have prioritized. But there's also some recognition that actually you need to really have space for yourself as a person, not just as a human rights activist or a human rights defender. And there's some need for personal space and taking time off and relaxing, even though this can be difficult. Just a few final observations. The term human rights defender and human rights are contested terms. The term human rights defender is still a newish one, is familiar only to some activists. And when some institutions don't understand the rights of human rights offenders and the issues they advocate for, they don't protect them. So LGBTI rights activists say, for example, that the National Commission of Human Rights and the Anti-Violence Against Women National Commission recognize LGBTI rights, but not the Witnesses and Victims Protection Agency. So when they approach the agency, they don't get support. And social networks are fundamental to protection. They facilitate the provision of protection support and increase the recognition given to defenders. The stronger and deeper the relationships between different protection actors, the more swiftly they can react and coordinate their actions to protect defenders. So when a defender is attacked, for example, when the defender is well connected and the protection actors are well connected to each other, then the response is much faster, the reaction is much quicker, and the coordination is much quicker. Unfortunately, many protection practices are resource dependent. If you want to relocate, you want to leave a certain place, or accompaniment, you want someone to accompany you, or you need legal defense, or cameras, or bodyguards, all of these require money. But protection resources, there are inequalities in the way that they're being distributed or made available. And really the defenders who are most connected, who are most respected and knowledgeable, they are the ones who are enjoying more protection resources. Yeah. Those who are more isolated, whose work is disrespected or stigmatized, who have less knowledge about strategies, tactics, and resources, they are less likely to benefit from protection initiatives and are more vulnerable. So these are just some sort of preliminary findings that we have. And really my paper was more about thinking, well, how do people think about the security, what affects the security, and how can protection initiatives support people in the way that they approach the security. So we have time now for discussion, and perhaps Kristen and Anya can come forward and we can have a more open-ended conversation about all the three papers. Anyone? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question for you, actually, Professor. So my name is Irene Kochanando, and I'm from Indonesia originally. And I work with the Citizen Lab, which is a cybersecurity and human rights research lab at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada.
Yes.
And I'm conducting a similar research as what you're doing, focusing on cyber attacks against civil society groups, particularly journalists, and in particular in Indonesia. So journalists who are covering sensitive issues like corruption, natural resources, land rights. And we also do work on psychosocial impact of surveillance. So that's what my question relates to. I wonder if you can elaborate more on the threats of surveillance that human rights defenders who you've worked with face. Is it more physical surveillance? Is it telecommunication surveillance, like wiretapping? Do you consider electronic surveillance as well? Because I've done work on internet censorship, filtering, and surveillance in Indonesia and Southeast Asia in general. So, do you consider these risks
Yeah. No, definitely surveillance is a key issue, and it's both physical, digital. Sometimes it's really people following, defenders around. Sometimes it's them checking on their Facebook pages, taking down their websites, monitoring their phones. So some of the strategies I didn't mention here are also around, changing your phone numbers when you think that someone has your numbers. Stop putting, like personal pictures on Facebook. Stop using Facebook. Reducing exposure. Being very careful about the things that you say in public or the statements. But definitely, digital security is a major issue.
That's really an interesting, because in the case of Burma, we get into in the case of Burma now, it's a lot of 80% of Burmese in Rangoon use Facebook, right? So actually, Facebook becoming very important, and you don't need to have email account. You just go to the T-shop and you pay like 20 cents, and they will open a Facebook account for you. But what is really interesting thing is that through the Facebook, human rights defenders has been jailed and arrested. So now one of the girls just recently released from jail because she bought her women's laundry to the military in chef hat, and she was arrested and jailed. So that's one question. Another thing that and when interfaith marriage law coming up, right? So women rights activists, when they put it, this is like a human rights violation, and they got a lot of serious threats. Not only Facebook, but also mobile phone calling, like a phone number. So that is really, it frightened a lot of activists because they are mostly single and working on it. And there is not any way that, controlling or protecting these women rights activists in particularly. And also another point that I have to make it also, they also use Photoshop to actually create a woman with naked body and all this stuff to the activists. Using this technology, to attack women, shaming them is actually, and Burma is a very serious problem for the women and right activists face. So what do you think that this kind of situation, considering that Burmese never had, even having fax machine sentenced to jail for 15 years, and now suddenly opened it up, and everybody became so actively engaging in Facebook. And what are the roles? How can you educate the society, and what can we do about it?
I think I've read a really interesting study based on women human rights defenders in Latin America, actually saying how that there's a gender difference in the way human rights defenders are treated. No, so what they suggest from their study is that women are it's more easy for them to be attacked. People are much more aggressive, and when they threaten them, they use physical violence. No, like the way that they threaten them is around rape and physical violence. So I think it'd be really interesting to do a study that looks at the gendered nature of attacks, online attacks. But obviously, actually, technology is also a way of protecting yourself. No, so the migrants and refugees in Malaysia, which was what I also studied, is their mobile phones that become really important. The mobile phones are the way that they contact, their friends to help them pay off bribes or to tell people where they are. Is there anybody else? I don't want to dominate this conversation, especially for other questions.
I still have a question to you. It's just because in the beginning you said you were working on, or the topic was human rights defenders, and this is not only activists, but it's far broader.
Yes.
So I was wondering, when you set up the study and you did the sampling, was it possible to include these people who maybe do not really understand themselves in these terms? Because you said there's also researchers from these countries and some gender description that would be interesting for me.
That was kind of tough for us, and I was thinking, practically, how would you do it? What if they don't self-identify? But because so few people self-identify as human rights defenders, you would have a very small pool of people, and you would have the more sophisticated, not sophisticated, but the ones who really buy into the international discourses, right? So we deliberately decided that anyone who we saw as researchers who promote and protect human rights, even if they don't self-identify as a human rights defender, we would include them. At first I thought, this is a bit dodgy, how am I going to argue that methodologically? Will I be questioned on it? But actually, human rights communities are really quite interlinked. People really kind of know each other after a while, So although I was worried that, will it be dodgy, if they're not really human rights people, actually the researchers who went to these different countries, they can really only get people to talk about the risks they face when they know each other. So it's really through relations and networks and social networks that you can recruit subjects anyway.
Was there a kind of, I'm trying to think this out loud, it seems like there's also going to be class dynamics, if that's a simple way of putting it, in how you engage as in the strategies you use as a human rights defender. So I was thinking about refugee community leaders who are human rights defenders, right? Although they wouldn't think of themselves in those ways. And the example you gave, Anya, of the person who'd said, there's your coffee money, have a ringgit. And it reminded me of a woman, a Karen women's activist that I know, who was always put to the forefront of dealing with the police because she would scold them, right? So she would say, how dare you do this? This is terrible. We are women and you are... And the kind of shock value of them not getting the response that they expect, which is, shrinking intimidation. That can be effective if you're powerless suddenly turning, where if you're middle class class intellectual elite trying to scold them, you're more likely to get in more trouble, right? Like, it's also about how, I don't know how to phrase that as a question, but it seems like there would be different effective strategies based on where you're situated in relation to the officials, if that makes sense.
We were just, when we were having breakfast together, I was thinking when you were telling me about your paper, in my mind there's always like the savvy refugee, you know, the savvy person who is like kind of jokey, you know, kind of confident, you know, will talk to the police and, you know how to have that conversation, you know, without sort of like cowering in fear. And they are the ones who, you know, if the police, in fact, they become the arbitrators or the negotiators, because the police will then call them and say, hey, I've got a Chin refugee here, I want some money from him, can you negotiate something, you know, and they'll be like, okay, 1,000 is too much, you know, can it be less, 500, maybe even less, you know, we see you every day, you know, they just know that they have this kind of confidence, and you're like, I can't pin it down.
It's a
like
skill set, though, right?
Yeah, it's a skill set.
And it's like they're in that role because they have the connections, they have the demeanor, and they're able to have, like, they can manage that interaction in a way that most people are afraid to do or unable to do. And I guess it's.
But I think it's like for anyone, like even with my passport, I think I have a better shot at negotiating with the police than my husband would, for example. I mean, even though it's also personality and experience. I mean, in the case of these migrant workers that I've interviewed, they don't have the networks, they don't have any NGOs. None of them that I encountered at all in Penang during all of these years had ever been in contact with an NGO. There are no NGOs for them to contact. For the minorities groups, they are aware of the Chin networks or the Kayin networks or whatever, but for all these just Burmese work, they don't have those networks, in my experience, in Penang at least, which has a lot to do with the fact that the Penang, or that human rights defenders and advocates of migrant rights in Malaysia are at risk. It's a repressive culture for that. So the organizations that I know are there have very limited resources and so on. But I think it's also got to, like we talked about before, that it's also got to do with experience. Like in the flat where I stayed, one of the brothers of one of the women came in, and when I arrived, I think it was last year, they had a meeting where they were like, no, we're sending him home, he's costing too much, because he couldn't bargain with the police. So it became a family decision that because he was shit at bargaining for bribes, he got to be sent home, and they could send the big sister instead because she would do better. So it is a reality that is really under. And it becomes, and I think what you said about that, I think is really important, to think about these different categories as intersecting. Like you have the otherness, you have illegality, you may have in Malaysia you don't have the refugee status, but you have the UNHCR card holders, and these are all different categories that they have to, it's a continuum of exclusion, I would rather say, than separate categories. Because the people that I interviewed, 2 of them are holders of a UNHCR card, but they entered as regular migrant workers who then managed to negotiate through bribes, actually, in detention centers to get in contact with blah, blah, blah.
Okay. Gustin, it's really interesting, like, and particularly your experience of working in Thailand and, like Malaysia and Chin and Korean, right? Like, so, and of course, like, the Chin community is very segregated in Mizoram, right? And one of the things that I'm really interested in is, like, Christianities and all the identities they can relate that to. Identity is shifting, right? Like, they can change who they are, right? Like, even though they are there. But kind of Chin community is particularly successful when they reach to the West. They became a doctor, and like all the medical profession, Chin are very successful, and they can come back and integrate. And then then when they do that, they can fake their otherness, and they can blend it in, right? So actually, really interesting that their identity before the social evil or whatever is fake. They being respected. And now you see they are building back with the community in Burma, right? So how do you compare with this Chin community, this kind of in and out community rebuilding, and compared to current? I know that that's not you are talking about it.
Yeah, I think it's they're very different. And I mean, I suppose that some of the differences were that the Karen I worked with were mostly the Karen in camps, and so they're a particular group of the Karen, right, who haven't had the same opportunities. I mean, those who are the urban refugees tend to have had to survive. Like in Delhi, you know, they say if you can survive in Delhi, you'll survive anywhere, because it's hard, right? It's really, really hard to be able to cope in Delhi, and so they have to become incredibly savvy and incredibly kind of capable. So those sorts of coping skills is one of the reasons that people will say they do well when they resettle, because nowhere in the US is as hard as New Delhi, where if you're coming from Umpium or Miloon or, you know, you're coming from a very protected, almost kind of, well, you come from quite an insular space and suddenly ending up in a huge city, which is just a very difficult challenge. So that's one reason that I think the Chin tend to adapt very well when they resettle. The other, I think, is language. So, you know, the Chin ethnic language uses Roman alphabet, where the Karen ethnic languages use the Burmese alphabet. So they learn English very quickly because they're used to reading in Roman alphabet, and so they pick up English very quickly, and they can read much more quickly than those who are coming from the other ethnic groups. So that's their other advantage. They're very good at tapping into the Christian networks, and so are the Karen, but they again, the language can be more of an exclusion because it's harder for them to pick up English and to become part of the English communities. So I think there's different reasons that mean that the Chin have been better in resettling, because they were coming from urban context and they were kind of coming more as self-selecting, where the camps resettlement came to them, right? They were just in the camps and suddenly they were being taken to the US, and they weren't in any way prepared for that. Where the Chin, they were seeking resettlement and they were living in cities. So yeah, I think that's a big difference. One of the difference that I seem to pick up between the two communities, I mean, the Karen in the camps, there was a much stronger sense of, I don't know, we're going to go home and rebuild our country and my future is back in Burma. The Chin is less like that, really. I think they see their future more in the West, and, you know, they'd like to do something in the future for Burma maybe, but it's not so much of a commitment and a conviction to going home. That's been my impression, anyway. I don't know what it's like for those who are already in the US, right? Do they then feel this need to go back? But certainly the Karen in the camps saw their long-term future being back in Burma, where the Chin as urban refugees, that's not their preferred outcome. Like, most of them would prefer a future not in Burma. That's my impression.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really like the presentation a lot, and I particularly like that you construct this thing that illegality is that not having papers is always the category that navigates somehow how migrants can use space or not. I was wondering, like, one thing is like this assumption that legality will make a difference to them. I was wondering, how do they look at that? Like, what is there an incentive for them to try to get papers in that situation where, or to get a working permit, whatever, in that situation where security is so important, and illegality can work as a means of opening different ways of negotiating?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think I just finished a paper on forced labor and legal status, and how the migration regime produces like involuntariness and coercion, and that in that setting, when looking at the way that so many migrants end up working, not just in poor conditions, because that happens to people all over the world, but under conditions that they have actually not agreed to, which is the definition of forced labor. And how the production of legality in Malaysia produces conditions of that. And there are, I think, three main reasons for that. One is the commercialized systems of recruitment that are used throughout the region, where it's super expensive to actually get a work permit. The other one has to do with what Alice has showed really good in her work on these the different rules that tie migrants to one specific employer. So you come in debt, and then you can't bargain there's a lot of deceit and fraud, and then you don't, I mean, there's no way you can bargain because you can't resign. Even though the labor contract is not what you actually agreed to, there's no way you can resign because your family owes some guy in your village $3,000. I mean, it's, and the third thing has to do with social exclusion. So the fact that these migrants are not in contact with NGOs, there's nowhere they can turn, they have no, many of them have very limited language skills and so on. These three things intersect to make legality a very dangerous status if you want to have a choice to maneuver, if you want to have room to maneuver in the labor market. So for many, all of the migrants that I interviewed that had entered Malaysia legally had actually at one point absconded from their employers. So they ran away from factories, they ran away from all sorts of employers in order to increase their freedom. And that was not just freedom from abusive employers, but also from recruiters, because the recruiters under the Malaysian system are allowed to manage foreign workers, not just recruit them, but also manage them, so they function as their employers, right? But then several of them, and I interviewed people who had changed their legal status up to 6 times during their stay in Malaysia. So you have an amnesty period, and then they sign up because, for different reasons. Sometimes because they're sick of the abuse of and the fear that it is to be illegal, to maneuver space in that way, and maybe they've been arrested and so on. But then they end up absconding again because they have no room to maneuver within the legal system. So I think it works in both ways. I mean, none of these statuses actually work to produce safety and freedom, but for many, freedom, the freedom from agencies, as they call them, or employers, was actually bigger. Like, they took the risk of negotiating. But that also comes with experience. So if you have been a long time in Malaysia, if you speak Malay, which is the language you have to negotiate with the police in, whereas most of the Burmese find employment with the Chinese, right? With Chinese employers that they can, so they learn to speak Hokkien, but they can't speak Malay, and then they can't bargain with the police, but they can bargain with their employer, and it's a whole set of skills. But I think it's very, very important to not perceive that there is such a thing as a legal migrant and an illegal migrant in Malaysia, because they live in the same community, and it's like they move between so many different times. And I think there's an obsession in much of this literature with regularization. We need to regularize migrants, but under which conditions? Getting a paper in Malaysia does not necessarily mean safety. It may mean that you can move more freely. One woman that I interviewed, she had come in as an illegal migrant. I mean, also we forget that debt is also part of illegal migration, right? Because you have to pay smugglers also. So she paid a smuggler, and then she stayed illegal for 8 years in Malaysia, working as a food vendor, taking over her Chinese employer's hawker stall and blah, 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 blah. And then she said, I don't want to be smuggled back. So she went to the Burmese embassy that has outsourced this, because it's all a privatized system, to a company, and then she made her passport and her work permit only to be able to take the flight home to Yangon, not having to. For 8 years she lived as an illegal. And it tells us something, I think, about the function of the state in producing insecurity rather than security.
Yeah, thank you very much. Listening to those presentations, it brings up so many things from my own work as well in migration. And coming back to Anya, what was just talking about this regularization. I worked with Burmese migrants in Thailand, but most of them were Karen, but they're all connected in some way, and it's very similar experience, except that the networks are not that strong for the Burmese people because they're latecomers compared to the Karen, for example. And there is even a joke among NGO workers that for a long time there was no legal way to go to Thailand as a Burmese migrant worker because there was no such visa. You could only go as a tourist, and then you needed a passport and you had to apply in advance, otherwise you could only be smuggled. But
willing to use it because they call it legal trafficking. You have to pay, it actually costs less to pay a smuggler than to pay all the fees to go legally, and still it is actually agents, individual agents, who do the actual casework, as they say. So the system is exactly the same, and you cannot be guaranteed that the contract that you're supposed to sign at home would be actually reflect the conditions that you will face when you arrive. So it doesn't give you more agency than you would have. Whereas where you are smuggled, you can at least choose your own smuggler. So that is the main expression of your agency. You have to choose a good smuggler, and that will protect you from trafficking. And another thing, I'm grateful for the question about legality. And to Kristen, I think at the beginning of your presentation you said about this strength of networks, again, among the ethnic nationalities. But again, it's not even, because if you speak about Christian Karen, it's very different from Buddhist Flow Karen. Who are always in between the Pama Buddhists and the Christian Karen. And they also feel, many of my interviewees, they also felt, and they were jealous in some ways of the Christian Karen networks that they had, the churches, the very strong community, and they said that we have nothing like that. We just have the learning centers.
Yeah, I think that's
true.
I think that's true. And you can see in Malaysia, where there's all of the different Burmese groups are represented, those with strong Christian communities have an organizational advantage, right? I mean, you have and particularly where you have very zealous Christian communities that have daily services and twice on Saturdays and Sundays. So you have this, it's a functioning meeting point. It's used in Malaysia as like a microloan system. You might give a very small amount as an offering each time you go to church, but if you're destitute and you're in hospital and you need money, then the church is most likely going to be where you can get the money. So it kind of functions essentially as like micro-lending. And for the Mon groups or for the other Buddhist populations, you don't have that ready-made organizational network. So that was kind of, in moving from the Karen to the Chin, that was sort of one of the things that I thought made it a more feasible comparison, because culturally, in some ways, there's a similar profile with the Chin and the Karen, because you do have this strong Christianity. And I wanted to see whether you had that same strength of organization in the urban settings rather than the camps. So that was kind of something that I was factoring into it. But you're right, it's not comparable across all the communities. I do think that there's more in common with the ethnic nationalities in that than there is with the Rohingya and with the Burman. And my theory on this is that it's a relationship to the state, actually. That for the Burman, you have this sense of looking to the state, right? You have, even if it's been a predatory, dysfunctional, abusive one, you kind of have a notion that government and statehood is how societies are ordered. For with the ethnic groups, that wasn't the case. You weren't really looking to a civil service or a structure. You were operating outside that and having a kind of a sense of organization that was totally coming from within. So I think there is still that sense of a kind of organization as something that's coming from within your group rather than at the level of government, I think is shared across the ethnic nationalities. Even if those who are Christian tend to have kind of that organizational advantage that the Buddhist groups don't, right? That's probably how I would see it. So they're still looking more, with Pokaran, there's still going to be a sense of community, and that's where you're going to look firstly for the kind of support. You're not going to be looking to local officials.
It's really interesting that, like, not only in refugee where they are, what kind of religion they have, we can see in the camp, right, Pokayan, Zagoka and different. But when they migrated, like they got a refugee status and they migrated to another third country, for example, in Australia, right? Like, so when Karen came in and they actually slid into church, the church would go and pick up, so settle, introduce all that stuff. What Buddhist Burman, when they migrate to there, they go to the temple and they have to make offering. The Buddhas, not the Buddha, the monk will not provide them, like a kind of resettlement, right? Like the monk will actually expect them to make a merit. So actually they're really interested in the concept of who they are, tying with religion. It's like first issue that they often bump Buddhist refugees at the ethnic are so lucky.
Oh, they convert also,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
in the
So
camps, those are converting are
Yeah.
often doing it on the basis that, if I'm animist or Buddhist, I have to give something, where if I'm
Yes.
Christian, I'm going to get something.
Yeah, and also like in the English level, it's also different, right? Like, in the church, in Christian, they volunteer came and taught English in the camp. So they are like kind of prepared already. A really good, interesting cases like U.S. for example, like they use Korean youth are like learning karate and judo because they feel like they are in migrant neighborhood and they have been bullied, and so they united themselves and they are fighting back. And American police are now working with them. So like the police invited them like doing training and all this stuff. Really interesting case. And but also another thing that when our Kirsten was talking about most Chin became many Chin became a doctor. Karen are working as a nurse. And Karen are turning back to go back to Burma because in Australia, when Karen arrived, they achieved because in Australia government, you can borrow the land, like community land to grow something. And Karen showed they are very successful, like agriculturalists. So like their closeness to land is very important in making decision of where they go or whether they want to go to another country or going back to Burma. So
And that just to follow up on when I answered your question about Chin relationship to returning, that was one of the things that was very different in the different field sites, right? So Aizawl, there's much more, so basically the more entrepreneurial, I suppose, Chin are the ones who've kind of gone further with the view to going to third countries. So those who are in Malaysia are much more invested in a future that is resettlement. Where those who are in Aizawl are the ones who don't want to go so far away, who want to return when it becomes more feasible, and so there are, that in that sense, the different migration routes sort of reflected. Yeah, so I think we should probably mention that.
I think there's a really interesting, picking up in your comment about agency, about people who are exploited or oppressed, and the importance of actually exercising agency under those conditions. And I'm thinking about the legal migrants you mentioned, about how do they navigate, the conditions of forced labor. Should they stay or should they run away? Running away is risky. It's like trading risks, or trading exploitation, however you say it. But I found the same thing. It puzzled me why people would opt for deportation when I interviewed people who are in detention centers, right? And for those of you who know Malaysian detention centers, the conditions are horrible. In so many ways. But some of them actually had the potential if they waited for resettlement at that point in time when I was interviewing them. So I thought, why don't you just stay? Why don't you stay under those conditions? I know it's horrible, but if you just stayed a bit longer, you could, get so much better in a sense, But they opted for deportation anyway, which meant that you have to be, you're at risk of trafficking and smuggling, and you have to pay huge fines, etc., which sounded a lot more risky. But still, they opted to be deported, So they would rather exercise agency with higher risks than just stay and be oppressed.
Interesting. I think also it's time to take a step forward with this agency debate, because we've said now for at least 20 years, it's like, migrants have agency. It's like in every paper, and it's like, okay, so what does that mean, right? And if we recognize that migrants are active agents, their actions also have the potential for social change, right? And maybe, I think it's time to take one more leap in that and actually properly discuss what do all these decisions that subordinate groups of people in society take, how does it influence the state? How does it influence state policy? How does it influence, in our case, we saw very clearly the fact that so many migrants run away make employers withhold their passports. It's a reaction to migrants' decisions. It doesn't come from nowhere. They know, employers know, I paid a recruitment company 3,000 ringgit to recruit this person, and this person is just going to run away straight away? I don't think so, so I take the passport. And if we don't, but I think sometimes the migration research is so frightened of blaming migrants for anything. So
But
it's
relational. It's is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, it is.
It's
But
It's
it's,
a dialectic relationship.
Because even with the bribes, right, the communities that are better organised get asked for more money because they know that the
They can
family
cough it up.
they'll cough it up. So the more effective, if you like, you are at providing community support, the higher the bribe is. The police know how much they'll get.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
you know, the attempts from the community groups were to say, okay, nobody should pay bribes. And of course that doesn't work because you need
No.
quite a lot of sacrifices
fucked,
before the police get the message.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of
Yeah.
people who end up in detention. So,
Yeah.
so nobody's going to be that front line of resistance. But the reasoning's sound, right? If you stop paying bribes, if the police realise they can't get money out of you, they're going to stop asking for so much money. If you don't keep giving more and more and pushing the relative value of the bribe up, but how do you break that cycle? So it's kind of.
But I think, I mean, in terms of state, if we think about security, which is one thing, but if we also think about, I mean, what does this corruption, I mean, corruption and migration is really understudied, right? It's mentioned, there are 100 million anecdotes of the way that corruption functions. Everyone who does migration studies know it's a necessity, right? But actually conceptualizing what does it mean? Because I mean, a very important part of corruption studies has been to focus on the social contract. The social contract between the citizen and the state. How is that affected? I mean, what is the likelihood of you trusting the state or not? And what does non-citizenship do for the social contract? In the Malaysian case, it's very clear. Why would you trust the Malaysian state? It's also a relationship between a non-citizen and a host state in the case of circular migration, rather than a citizen and their state, or host states in some cases, right? And I think also in the case of this, where you have a setting where internal border controls are so important, corruption also impacts the actual location of the border, which we talked about. Like, I interviewed police officers who said, well, on a Friday afternoon, we will do a roadblock here because we know that all the migrants are let out of the construction site, so it's easy money. So the actual logic of the protection of the border is renegotiated, because you're not trying to protect the state from unwanted foreigners, but you're actually trying to make weekend money. So the geography and the logic of the border is actually renegotiated through these practices, which I think it invites us to think one more round about what corruption and migration, what that intersection actually is.
The dilemma about corruption is when you have a very repressive system like the Malaysian system, corruption is a way of escaping
Of course.
the repression.
It's a way to negotiate.
Yeah.
It's a space of negotiation, as Anjali
And that was, when I was an activist, that was the dilemma I had. Do you raise the corruption? Because if you do a crackdown on the police, no, if you raise the issue of corruption, then you lose the bargaining power that migrants have. And when you lose the bargaining power, it's not just 50 ringgit, it's 2,500 ringgit and detention, arrest, detention, and trafficking to the border to pay the money there to come back, you know. So you have this like awful dilemma, you know.
It
Should
is
you crack down
difficult,
or don't you? You know?
Exactly. It is a terrible dilemma. But so is all of these things. Like we talked about, I had so many problems before I asked them to draw these maps, because I was so frightened. Will I lead them, the police, to them if I expose their spatial strategies? Where in the city they go? Will I lead the police there? And I read all this post-colonial literature and methodology and blah, blah, blah. And then the first paper that I put down in front of the guy, I said, can you draw this map? And he said, oh, cool, you're going to make a map so that we know which places to avoid. I was like, yeah, okay, I'm going to choose that perspective. So it's always, I mean, the migrants themselves, at least those that I have interviewed and encountered, they're so sick of the corruption. I mean, it is a space to negotiate, but they're also really sick of it, because it is also very arbitrary. It's, I mean, it's not transparent in the least. You have, I mean, it's really a big, big problem.
It'd be interesting to get the police to draw maps and then you come up.
They know.
I just want to respond to your comment earlier about the gender aspect of online attacks against human rights defenders. We're actually currently running a study on this issue with local partners in Colombia and Costa Rica. So once we have the results, I can share that with you. And we also are studying cyber attacks against news organizations of minority groups in Burma. So looking at the Karen news groups, the Kachin, the Shan. So that's still ongoing as well. And actually, I have a workshop tomorrow at 9 a.m. where we're going to talk about Indonesia, Myanmar, Thailand, and the Philippines. So it'd be great if you can be there to hear your feedback. And about what you said earlier about how a lot of human rights defenders would then choose to use less Facebook or Twitter. I actually spoke to Malaysian human rights defenders just last week, and they gave me a counterexample. So they say that the situation in Malaysia right now is really bad, particularly for journalists reporting with the Sedition Act and reporting on the current corruption scandal plaguing the Prime Minister. That if in what you do you report on these issues, overusing Facebook and Twitter is actually a good strategy. So journalists today would tweet, today I have a meeting here with this person at this place, and so when then they don't tweet for a long time, then their colleagues start to wonder, oh, where did Alice go? Or where did Dr. Mar go? And they told me a story of one journalist who was interviewing someone, and the police or somebody tried to grab them into a van.
Right.
And someone saw this happening and started tweeting it.
Right.
And then people started following the van and live tweeting it. This is happening, it's now crossing the street and this and that. And then I guess they saw that on Twitter too and then dumped the guy in the corner. So it foiled the kidnapping attempt to take this guy out of state. And I was like, wow, like I never thought of that, because in other examples that we've seen, like I said, we're running the study in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Latin America. Everyone say, don't use Facebook, don't overshare on Twitter, don't overshare on Facebook. But in the Malaysian example, because it's really, the situation's really bad, oversharing is a good thing. So
I suppose it might depend on how embedded it is in the society, right?
Exactly.
So you know how if you're in an area like where not that many people are tweeting, then so if in the Malaysian context, if you have that really vibrant online engagement and social media engagement, then that's going to make it more useful to use that as a protection strategy rather than to see it as a kind of another avenue of surveillance and threat.
But also, like in Nigeria, you say online tweeting, right? What is happening? Upgrading, constantly doing this. So, like, people are, wow, now, people can see and feel, and they know where to go, how. So, like, just, tweeting on the spot, right? Like, so it's just like, people can see what is situation, and like, activist or active citizen will come and, try to help, So actually, I think that is a very good point, right? Like not only how many people use it, but upgrade it, not like yesterday there was arrested, not like that. That's happening, so, yeah.
But using, I think, internet as a security network is, I had my interpreter for this project that we worked together. When he left, he was also an illegal migrant. Him and his girlfriend, they used this. They sent it to me every 1 hour of their journey so that I could locate them. I was sitting actually in New York going, oh, I don't want to, no, please. And they were like, now we're on this boat, and it's like a boat that looks like it's about to sink. It's full of bags, and they're like, and I'm going, oh. Okay, they're on like Google Maps. Where are they? They're here, okay. And they did that the whole way until they hit and they stopped work, because then the internet connection was gone. But So I think it's used increasingly by people at risk in general as a way to pin down by Google Maps, where are you? We see it in the refugee crisis in Europe. I mean, they use Facebook and internet the whole time to do that.
But also like really interesting in Indonesia, right? Like in Indonesia, when there's a clash between a Christian and Muslim, so what they created, like in a community, a group of young people, they created. So as soon as there's something fighting of, for example, Muslim banning a Christian, how church or whatever, they tweet it. And then the other people just go to the spot and take a photograph and tweet back. No, it's not true. It's like, fabricated the news. So actually that involved and stop, that's like, fabricated news that actually people are told that prevent a lot of community clashes. So,
Because technology, like any other media, has this dual power, right? The power to mobilize, to activate, to use as a way of amplifying issues, but also as a way of attacking people. And I think, coming back to, related to what you're saying about agency, there is a dialogue that's happening between the perpetrator and it's dynamic, no? So the very fact that they use Twitter to mobilize people is also why perpetrators then use the Twitter messages to attack them. You know, it's like this sort of like dance. I don't like dance, it's not the right word, but you know, this relational interaction between repression and activism. Yeah.
Yeah, and coming back to that, what Anya said about this agency and how it actually shapes and is relational. And yeah, if I can make another announcement. At 11 tomorrow, we also have a panel about Southeast Asian borderlands. And actually, my presentation is based on my 2 chapters of the PhD, where I show that basically the management of the Thai-Burmese border was eventually transformed because of the scale of migration that changed and because everybody was going illegally. So basically corruption has become the inbuilt channel of going illegally. And systematized it has become commercial.
Oh, we should have known that. We're doing a special issue on corruption and migration. We should have done this. Next the
time.
follow-up.
Next time.
I'll invite you to.
Part 2. And also, I'd like to follow announcement tomorrow. And season opportunity, right? Tomorrow also I'll be screening my film about dreams of dutiful daughters, which is also tying it up with the identity, agency, and corruption, and migration and gender. So it will be good fun to watch.
Good fun, is that the word?
Yeah. I'll have to check it out.
Don't look at this one. This is the reason why I'm late. Because it says
Yeah, the wrong
I'm really sorry I
time.
missed the
Because the
presentation.
time
It says 4:30.
Yeah, we
Yes.
saw that.
Yeah,
So
I was
we're
confused
sorry.
because I didn't know whether we should start at 4 or 4:30, and we thought, okay, maybe 4 o'clock is safer.
But they were already several. Maybe it's just
11:30.
11. But double check with the other. There's a few errors in that book. Well, it's been really interesting discussion. Thank you so much for contributing so actively and yeah. Yes.
It's at 11 tomorrow.
Oh, 11.
Is it
Oh,
11?
we forgot it, yeah? Of course, you have
Yeah.
11 o'clock. Okay.
Sorry, I have to check that myself.
Very good, yeah.
So there are more opportunities tomorrow to contribute and continue this discussion that we've been
Their
having.
rivals.
Yeah.
Systematic behavior.
Good. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, everyone.